Good afternoon. My talk's going to be on land change analysis and vegetation thickening at Moonpoint on Fraser Island in Queensland. Action I'm going to be taking. I'm going to be looking at vegetation thickening and fire regimes, so what those two terms are, so what fire regimes are and what vegetation thickening is. I would like to identify the study area at Moonpoint and then briefly go over the methodology within the landscape change modeler of TerSet, which is a GIS and modeling software, and then the quantified vegetation assessment we used, which was looking at using the latitude and longitude and working out areas of vegetation change. The results that we received and we obtained from our analyses, a discussion, conclusions, and then references. Okay, so vegetation thickening really is looking at how vegetation has thickened and how it's encroaching in relation to changes within fire regimes. Now we know that vegetation thickening does occur when fires are withheld over a number of years, and of interest we would like to know what was actually happening on Moonpoint. Is that vegetation thickening? Is there a change in the dynamics of the peripheral areas around the wetlands, the empedismo minor wetlands, which is a wire rush, and over the area of the pattern fens. So we used aerial photographs that we georeferenced, and we used TerSet land change modeler to be able to look at the change of vegetation. And we did it in three broad categories of vegetation. We used forest, and obviously a eucalypt forest is very dynamic, but we classified all forest as forest. Banksia area, because that's unique, and I'll discuss that a bit later. And we had Banksia Islands, and then of course the empedisma wetlands, or wetlands as such. So fire as well is a very important driver of vegetation, and it actually changes the dynamics of constituent species within an area if you start to change fire regimes as well. So if fire regimes change naturally due to climate change or induced or driven by climate as such and changing climate, you find there's normally an associated change of vegetation and constituent species there. But it's a particularly important ecological driver for the production of pyrogenic vegetation. If we start to see increases in fire, we start to see a change in the dynamics towards more pyrogenic vegetation. So they become more, not fire tolerant, but fire adaptive, and you start to lose your pyrophobic species like your rainforest species and so on that aren't tolerant or adaptive or have any adaptive traits to fire tend to disappear or become locally extinct. However, the understanding of all of these really is actually poorly understood at the moment when we start to look at the frequency, season, intensity, and sequence of fire. I won't go into those now because it's not really the talk, but those are the interesting parts as well when we start to look at sequence. So when we look at Fraser Island, we're starting to look at Moonpoint. It really is important that we have an understanding of when the first charcoal records were can be identified. And that's approximately 440 million years ago, and that was associated with the first stomata bearing plants. However, in 345 to 2.5 million years ago, which is pre-human era, there was an increase in charcoal deposits, and that fluctuation in charcoal deposit and increase has been associated with changes in atmospheric oxygen. So we see with increases in oxygen in the atmosphere, we see changes and increases in fire and increase in fire levels or number of fires. From an Australian point of view, northeast Queensland, we have records of Aboriginal burning from as early as 45,000 years ago. On Fraser Island at Moonpoint, our records go back according to the depth of the core, which is approximately 25,000 years ago. But there's been a significant change of fire regimes, and that's occurred in particular with the arrival of Europeans and the settlement of Europeans on Fraser Island. So that's about 200 years ago we start to see a change in the dynamics of vegetation. And just quickly to show you that, I think it's important that we have a look at so I just want to get my pointer on. We have a look at the central area here of color, which is really important. And I'll just quickly explain. This here is years, so it's 24,000 years through to present, and then we have the depth of the core from 150 centimeters to 0 centimeters here. So that is the year, that is the depth. And we can see, though, that approximately 24,000 years ago to 18,000 years ago, we had rainforest species here. They were typical rainforest. However, there was a change in climate, and we know that it became drier, and there's a change in the dynamics of fire. I mean, as the rainforest vegetation started to disappear, the pyrogenic vegetation started becoming more dominant in the landscape, and we start to see our sclerophyllous vegetation becoming very dominant within this particular area. Yeah, and this is really supported by the microcharcoal evidence here, that we start to see an increase in fire. However, this peak here that we have is really interesting, because that is around about 200 years ago with the arrival and settlement of Europeans on Fraser Island. So we've got this massive peak, and that tends to correlate with the arrival of cattle and with forestry and clearing and burning on the island that occurred approximately 200 years ago. And then we see another peak, which is occurring around about present, which is now. And if you look at all these vegetation types here, you'll start to see there's changes in vegetation, particularly the rainforest species, and you start to see the pyrogenic vegetation starts to become more dominant as we move through time towards the present. And this is all pollen that has been identified and taken from those core samples and has been dated and profiled accordingly. So where is Moonpoint? Well, Moonpoint is the western tip of Fraser Island, approximately in the middle of the island, and you can see where the orange circle is. It identifies the area that we took the core samples so that we could look at the charcoal and to identify the fire regimes over time as well. Okay, looking from a Google Earth satellite imagery, you can see this is the wetland. So this is here what we know as the Empedisma wetlands, or the pattern fen. This area here is the forest area. And then we have this island here, which is actually the Banksia. And then there's a little appendix here of Banksia as well. So what we did was we took 2 aerial photographs that we georeferenced, and we utilized those using Esri ArcMap, the vector, and then we converted our data from vector to raster, and then we entered that raster data into TerSet for land change analysis. We did the analysis and how land has changed from the past to present. We then looked at land transition potential modeling. So what is the potential for this landscape to change? And then we did change prediction into the future to 2066. At that time, we were looking at trying to see 45 to 50-year changes over time. So the aerial photographs, we have 1958 and 2010, and we had those broad categories of forest, wetlands, Empedisma wetlands, we called it wetlands, and then the Banksia and the Banksia. The Banksia appendix is very clear here, as well as the Banksia is very clear there. And you can see the forest is really quite clear. And all of this area here, these are pattern fens, those little black spots that look like freckles. There are lots of freckles around here and so on. That's all water. So those are the pattern fens within the Moonpoint area. We georeferenced the aerial photographs, and we utilized, as I said, Esri and TerSet, and we put that into the landscape modeler, and we let that run to analyze those particular changes for those 3 broad vegetation categories. We did the same with quantified vegetation analysis, where we divided the aerial photographs, the 1958 and the 2010, into lines of latitude and longitude to be able to it worked out between 25 and 30 meters. So it's 25 by 30 square meters, so 25 by 30 meters. And we worked out the area of each of those squares that had forest, wetlands, or Banksia monoculture forest. Really interesting in that those Banksia areas were actually just pure Banksia. We did not find any eucalypt in there, and there were no other tree species growing. It was just Banksias growing, and I don't have an explanation for that. We're not really sure. The further investigation and research needs to go into why there were just Banksias there and no other no eucalypt species or anything else in there. from our results, you can see that from the landscape modeler that we had three different series. We had the 1958-2010, we had the 2010 to 2016, because I took a satellite imagery of 2016 and I compared that to 2010, and I also looked at 1958 and I compared it to 2016 as well. So we have three different analyses here of land change. And this is looking at percentage change of vegetation over time. So it's not looking at change over area, it's change of vegetation. And you can see that the Banksia there was a substantial change in the amount of vegetation between 58 and 2010, according to the aerial photographs, and the same with forest. But we had an overall net loss of wetlands. And we see that in 2010 and 2016 as well, increase in Banksia. There's been a gain in forest, but a loss in wetlands. And between 58 and 2016, we see Banksia, there's a gain, forest there's gain, but there's overall loss of wetlands. So although forest and Banksia gain, we have that loss of wetlands. And looking at then in not just vegetation percentage change, we look at it in area change. So percentage of area change, we see that Banksia, there's a gain in forest, but there's an overall loss in wetlands between 1958 and 2010. You see the same again in 2010 and 2016, that Banksia and forests, that there's gains but losses in wetlands. And between 1958 and 2016, we see again that there is increases or gains in Banksia and forest, but an overall loss in the wetlands overall. So having done that, we then need to look at the spatial trends of change, and we used the third order polynomial for this, and we did 58 2010, 2010 2016, 1958 to 2016, as in our previous slide. So we have our 1, 2, and 3, and we know that 1 is 1958 to 2010, 2 is 2010 to 2016, and then 1958 to 2016 on the right over here. And looking at A at the top, is the wetlands to all, the changes of what's happening to wetlands from between 58 and 2010, and there's a overall increase in vegetation overall and a loss in wetlands. We see the same within forests and wetlands, that the wetlands have decreased substantially and that there's a gain in forests. And then wetlands to Banksia, we see that Banksia increases and there's an overall loss of wetlands. So wetlands are decreasing in each one of these here. You can see the blue areas where there's a decrease or loss of wetlands. So that's looking at the trend of change, or spatial trend of change. Then looking at the potential for transition, so saying, right, we now need to look at the possibility or the changes there again, and we've looked at this as well from 1958 to 2010, 2010, 2016, 1958 to 2016 here as well. So it's 1, 2, and 3, and we've looked at in relation from A to B and looking at how these have changed over time. And you can see that there's a change in there's a loss, sorry, of wetlands and a gain of forest over here. And we see in this one here an overall increase in Banksia but a loss in wetlands. So comparing those two, and then we looked again here, the transition potential, increase in forest. Sorry, this is Banksia, increase in Banksia, and then here we've got an increase in forest and an increase in forest as well overall. But interestingly, taking all of that and then feeding that further in to look at change prediction, what is the possibility of change in the future to 2066, we see that overall taking Banksia and forest are increasing, that there's this net gain with a net loss of wetlands between each one, 1958 and 2010. This is 2010, 2016, and this is 1958 to 2016. Overall, all three of these, looking at the projection into the future, taking the data that we have fed into to a set, we see that there are net gains of forest and Banksia with a net loss of wetlands. So there's that trend, there's that move and loss of wetlands overall. Looking at the quantified vegetation, that's not obviously the manual method to look at that. This is really what's important, the percentage area, is that we have gains of forest and banksia, but an overall loss of wetlands, which is supported really well in this table here, looking at your gain of forest, loss of wetlands, gain of banksias here. So it really is interesting. You can see that there that it supports what we were finding. So actually using aerial photographs, actually analyzing them physically and manually, and utilizing models, they are predicting the same type of change, the same trends into the future. And this map really is just showing you the fires that have occurred in this particular area of Moonpoint, and that's normally about every 12 years that we've been seeing that. So there's a dynamical change in fire regimes that is set every 12 years, wildfires or fire management. So between 12 and 18 years, we're seeing these differences in fire on that. Which leads me to the conclusion that with these changes in the dynamics of fire and fire regimes on the island, there is definite evidence that the wetlands and Moonpoint is changing, and that the vegetation structure and composition is showing that there's a decrease in Impedisma minus. So the Impedisma minus wetlands or wire rush is definitely decreasing, and that there's an increase and thickening and encroachment taking place around the peripheral areas of Moonpoint, and that our future projections show that thickening and encroachment of forest by the year 2066 over the wetlands is definitely, well, I shouldn't say definitely, but it has the probability and possibility of occurring with the present fire regimes as they are. Well, I'd like to thank you very much for listening.